Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear viewers. I am Professor Dr. Muhammad Usman, Professor of Physiology, and today in this short video we will learn about the resting membrane potential. So let's begin. Resting membrane potential, as the name indicates, it simply means the potential or the potential difference across the cell membrane when it is at rest, which means that when it is not conducting any nerve impulse or the action potential. So when the membrane, especially the excitable cell membrane, when it is not conducting any nerve impulse, then the potential difference or the voltage across this membrane, it is called as resting membrane potential. Now there are various factors which establish the resting membrane potential. Actually, it is established by the diffusion potentials of permeable ions, that is the ions which can pass through the cell membrane. Each permeable ion, it attempts to derive the membrane potential towards its equilibrium potential. हर परमिएबल आयन की ये कोशिश होती है कि वो मेम्ब्रेन पोटेंशियल को अपनी नन्स पोटेंशियल के मुताबिक सेट करे. फिर किसकी बात मानी जाएगी? आयन्स विद द हाईएस्ट परमिएबिलिटी. ओके, आयन्स विद द हाईएस्ट परमिएबिलिटी और कंडक्टेंस will make the greatest contribution to the resting membrane potential, and the ions with the lowest permeability will make little or no contribution. So we can say that it is established by potassium ions, sodium ions and sodium potassium pump. Resting membrane potential is maintained by sodium potassium pump. So let's first of all discuss the role of the potassium ions, because potassium ions are the ions with the highest permeability through the membrane. The membrane has the highest permeability for potassium ions because the membrane contains potassium leak channels through which the potassium moves from inside to the outside, and the membrane also contains sodium leak channels. But the number of potassium leak channels, okay, the number of potassium leak channels is about 100 times more than the sodium leak channels. That is why the permeability of the potassium ions through the membrane is much higher than the permeability of the sodium ions. So if the potassium ions were the only factor responsible for the resting membrane potential, I repeat, if the potassium ions were the only factor responsible for the resting membrane potential, then of course the resting membrane potential would be equal to the nernst potential for potassium ions, which is minus 94 millivolts. But we know that the membrane is also permeable to sodium ions. So this is the sodium leak channel. It is also present in the membrane, and through this channel the sodium ions move from outside to inside along their concentration gradient. So if the sodium ions were the only factor responsible for the resting membrane potential, then the charge on the membrane or resting membrane potential would be equal to the nernst potential or the equilibrium potential for the sodium ions, and we know that the nernst potential or the equilibrium potential for the sodium ions is plus 61 millivolts. But we know that normally the membrane is permeable to both the sodium ions and potassium ions. So the combined effect of both of these ions on the membrane potential, it can be calculated by Goldman equation, and when we put the values of these ions, the Goldman equation gives us a value of minus 86 millivolts, minus 86 millivolts. It gives us the combined effect of the sodium ions and potassium ions. But we know that normally the resting membrane potential in large neurons, it is about minus 90 millivolts. So the question arises from where the additional minus 4 comes. So here comes the role of third factor, that is the role of the sodium potassium pump. So what is sodium potassium pump? Basically, as you can see in this figure, the sodium potassium pump, it is present in all the cell membranes, and it is an electrogenic pump. That is, by using ATP, this pump moves the ions against the concentration gradient. So for its each activity, it moves 3 sodium ions from inside of the membrane to the outside, and it pumps 2 potassium ions from outside to the inside. So, in this way it is pumping the ions against their concentration gradient. And if you look closely, you will find out that for each activity it is moving 3 positive ions from outside to it is moving 3 sodium ions from inside to outside, and it is moving 2 positive ions from outside to inside. So, in this way for each activity there is loss of 1 positive charge from the inside. Okay. For each activity there is loss of 1 positive charge from the inside. So, continuous activity of the sodium potassium pump will cause of loss of positivity from the cell. Continuous activity of this sodium potassium pump will cause loss of positivity from the cell, and loss of positivity is equal to gain of negativity. So, this contributes additional minus 4 millivolts, and now minus 86 which comes from the sodium and potassium ions, and minus 4 millivolts which come from the this activity of the sodium potassium pump. This makes minus 90 millivolts. So, we can say that the net membrane potential or the resting membrane potential with all these factors operative at the same time is about minus 90 millivolts, which is the resting membrane potential. Thank you for watching this video. Please consider subscribing to this channel. Stay blessed. Allah Hafiz.